So without further ado, I will turn it over to Eric.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. So let me know if if something doesn't work. So let's see, share, and I'm going to share this part first. So I'm not going to go into presentation mode, so you can probably see my slides ahead of time. But so I'm going to talk about the sleep and respiratory care interview process. So Philips is a gigantic company. You know, Philips has a ton of employees. You know, it's something like 80,000. So when you walk through Target and you see Philips televisions and Philips light bulbs and Philips Novelco razors and Philips Sonicare toothbrushes, none of that is me. I don't work on any of those stuff. Instead, I work with a group called Sleep and Respiratory Care, which is headquartered in Pittsburgh, down the street from Carnegie Mellon at the Bakery Square office. So we are the manufacturer of CPAP devices, ventilators, and oxygen concentrators. We started as a separate company called Respironics. We were acquired by Philips in 2008. So Philips is kind of going through the transition where we originally were that light bulb company that everybody knew, but now we're more of a healthcare technology company. We're headquartered in Murraysville. We're still moving offices over to the new building in Bakery Square. So probably in the next month or so, I'll change the slide to say that we're now headquartered in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in Bakery Square office. Just to give you a little bit of information about what I do, my main job as a software developer, I write code. But as part of that responsibility, that includes doing things like interviews. You know, I help the division screen people to identify talent. Talent acquisition folks, recruiters, HR folks, they're really great at identifying candidates, but it's kind of hard for them to gauge who's good at writing code. So our interview process always includes technical screenings. And in order to do that, they need somebody who is good at writing code. So they ask me to get involved. Okay, so this is an actual job description for a mid-level software engineer at Philips. So when I see this, there's a whole lot of words in here: motivated, hardworking, detail-oriented. Yeah, that's interesting. I guess we would always want those things in somebody, but then you kind of get into what the words are, the really important ones to describe what the position is all about. So cloud-based, agile, Java, microservices, REST, those are specific things. So when I interview somebody, I almost always ask them questions about these things because we've highlighted those as the key skills that we want in the position. So whenever you're applying for an interview, applying for a position, applying for a software engineering specific role, make sure you know what those things are. Make sure you know what those specific skills they're looking for actually are asking for. I've seen a lot of people apply to positions and completely wrong skill set, don't understand the technology, different set of interests. Kind of somebody applies for this and said, well, I really like doing UI work. Well, that's not mentioned here anywhere. So is this the right job for you? Probably a waste of my time, probably a waste of your time. So make sure you understand what the position is about. Make sure you understand what we're looking for and that your skills and your resume are really tailored to match the description. I'd say do your homework. There's a ton of places where you can learn about a company. Now, in a company like Philips, it's a little bit harder because we're such a conglomerate that you can't really know exactly what division you're interviewing for. But now with LinkedIn, it's pretty easy to find people, look them up. You can get a professional LinkedIn account, and that allows you to look at anybody's profile. So you can find me, you can find people I work with, you can find the division that of Philips that I work for. There's all kinds of news articles, social media, people talk about things, and then study that job description because that'll tell you exactly what you're interviewing for. So a real life example of this, we had a candidate who got to a panel interview, and then afterwards, one of the interviewers said he didn't know what he was applying for, didn't even know what the job was. So not surprisingly, that candidate was rejected because the person hadn't really cared enough to actually look into the position they were interviewing for. That is, they didn't know anything about Philips, and they didn't know anything about the job. So why are we even talking to each other? Zoom etiquette, I think this was a famous example where, you know, the kids walk in the background. I've got my background blurred, but you can do certain things to try to make it a more professional setting. Dress for an interview. The guy was supposed to be on the news, so of course he's wearing a suit and tie. I've interviewed people who, because they're on Zoom, they think that it's okay to show up in their pajamas, just because they're in their house. You have to remember that it's still an interview. So dress like you're in an interview. If you were there in person, then try to do the same thing. I always appreciate when people actually take that extra step. Be aware of your background. In this case, I think the background was appropriate. The guy had a map, but I guess he forgot to lock the door. I've seen people do all kinds of interesting things, with not just the technology that blurs the background, but I've seen people put up room dividers. I've seen people hang a sheet, just something to kind of, block out distractions in the background. I've had interviews where I'm talking to somebody and then the dog walks across the background or does something like that. Well, some of that stuff is beyond your control, but some of that stuff isn't. So, take the time to think about where you are and what's going on around you. Try to limit noise and distractions. Sometimes that's unavoidable. Today I was in a meeting with one of the managers and she had contractors in her house, and every time she tried to talk, you get the jackhammering kind of noise. Not really avoidable, but something that is distracting and makes it harder to talk. The opening question. So once you actually get into the interview, this is kind of how I try to start every interview, with just an open-ended question. I try not to ask, tell me about yourself, but that's the kind of question you might get. That third bullet point, which project are you most proud of? That's more similar to the question I usually ask. I usually say something like, I'm not in talent acquisition, I'm not a recruiter, I'm not in HR, I write code. So what project have you recently worked on that was really cool or really interesting, or something you'd like to highlight on your resume? And then let's talk about that in terms of software engineering. So all three of these questions that I have on the slide, tell us about yourself, what's something you worked on that's interesting, or what project are you proud of? Those are actually the same question. And what it's really an opportunity is for you to use an elevator pitch. 2 minutes, 3 minutes, tell me about the things that you worked on, tell me what you're all about, why I should consider you for this position, and make sure it relates to the job description. So if we go back to that original job description for a mid-level software engineer doing Java microservices and REST, a good answer might be, I'm currently working on a microservice-based architecture. We're using Spring Framework to implement a Java-based service tier. Okay, good. Now we can start talking about this stuff because I know what a lot of those words are. Let's talk. A real answer that I thought was maybe the worst answer I've ever gotten. Somebody said, well, I'm not really proud of anything I've ever worked on. Like, that's kind of a downer. You don't like any of the things you've ever done? That's disappointing. I've had other goofy answers. Somebody said, the project that was coolest and the thing that they were most proud of was when they built their model airplane and that they flew it around, some mountain. Like, that really wasn't what I was looking for either. I was really looking for something involving software. So relate it to the job description. Tell me about something cool that you wrote that's relevant to the position you're interviewing for. I'm not here to be your friend. I'm here to figure out how to help you get a position, how to help you get a job. Sometimes interviews include technical questions, and I call them the rapid fire questions. Sometimes I kind of refer to them as the Jeopardy questions. You'll get these kind of depending on the interviewer. I don't like to ask these questions, but some interviewers do like to ask these. So, does Java support multiple inheritance? What's the difference between the JRE and the JDK? What's a completable future? So I think in a lot of cases here, they're testing the validity of your claims on your resume. So people will write stuff on their resume. I'm an expert in the blah, blah, blah. And if you don't know the answer to these, then that sort of establishes that you were using some hyperbole or some exaggeration on your resume. My advice to you is answer truthfully. So if the interviewer asks you a question like, what's the difference between an abstract class and an interface, and you don't know, say so. Don't try to trick the interviewer. I have seen people, usually I insist that people put their camera on, just kind of like I am right now. And I have seen people, trying to repeat the question, difference between abstract class and inheritance. Well, that's a really good question. I'll have to think about it for a second. Oh, an abstract class is, and then they give off this perfect answer that I suspect came off of their phone since they were holding it in their hand. So, to me, that defeats the purpose, right? I'm not asking you something because I want to know if you can search Google quick. I'm asking you to see if you understand a concept. A lot of people will memorize the book and they'll recite this perfect answer, and that's okay. But the reason I ask questions like that is because I want to understand if you understand it. So one of my favorite questions is, suppose we are talking about encapsulation to somebody who's never written a program before. How would you explain it? How would you explain it to somebody who isn't technical? Like, why does it matter? Like, what does encapsulation mean to you in a non-programmer vernacular? I had somebody give this answer in an interview once, and I said, we asked about some of these questions, and then the guy said, well, I don't really know anything. I just search Stack Overflow all day for the things that I need to do. And that's kind of a funny answer to me, because I do think it's true, and there's a lot of value in knowing the solution to a problem if other people have already solved it. Trying to solve a problem on your own is okay, but frankly, the reason we use frameworks and the reason we use off-the-shelf technology is because other people have spent a lot of time solving a problem that we're just barely getting into. So they probably solved it better than we could. But at the same time, if you spend all day, every day, searching Stack Overflow, it's kind of an insult, right? I mean, something, you're pretty good at stuff. I mean, you can say that you search Stack Overflow to validate your answer. You approached a problem and you knew what to look for. But I mean, at least give yourself some credit. That person seemed pretty down on himself. So cultural fit questions, soft skills assessment. I'll explain a little bit more about my favorite graphic here on slide 10 in a second. But interviews are usually a combination of hard skills and soft skills, right? So the hard skills are, can you do the coding? Do you know the ones and zeros? Do you know the language syntax? Do you know how to handle exceptions and errors and problems like that? Whenever we do an interview, we're also looking at soft skills. So in particular at Philips, the managers often ask these cultural fit questions. So describe a time when you had a disagreement with another person and how did you handle it? You sort of have to draw on your own experience. And in particular, they're going to ask you about team projects or individual projects. If you have any real life work experience, internships or summer positions, you can relate back to those. But you should kind of be prepared for some of those kinds of experiences. And really, if you can think of interesting allegories, things that happen to you, you can be prepared with those and kind of answer the question, regardless of what it is, by drawing on those, those examples. So provide details, give really specifics about it. Somebody said, even if you've never been in a disagreement with any of your coworkers, you could say, well, I haven't really had a real blow up with anybody at work, but in cases where I haven't agreed with somebody, we approached it through doing 1, 2, 3. We went to a conference room and we drew on the whiteboard, and then we took a break and we got a cup of coffee, and then we went back to the problem, and then the problem, then we just had a brainstorm and we solved the problem very easily. So provide details. If you made a mistake, it's okay to say I handled it badly, because that shows growth. You can say I learned more. I learned things in this experience that made me a more valuable employee. I made some mistakes, and now I'm, this is what I would have done differently. A bad answer, again, another bad answer I've gotten. Somebody said, all of my coworkers are idiots, and that's why I'm looking for a new job. You can't say anything positive about the people you work with. I mean, something made you want to work there to begin with. So technical IQ versus emotional IQ. At Philips, we measure people on kind of two different dimensions of what we would call excellence, right? So we can have people who are technically excellent, and we have people who are culturally excellent. So it's helpful to kind of think about the most extreme examples on the two axes, and that kind of highlights, you know, what people would be like. So if you imagine somebody who is technically excellent but a really poor culture fit, that would be kind of what I would call the rock star programmer. You know, I've had somebody I was interviewing once said, you know, I'm a really smart developer. In fact, I'm so smart and so good, you can't really even assess how good I am. I should be interviewing you. Well, and I guess our conversation is over because you're so much smarter than me that you know, if I can't evaluate you, then I guess we're done here. We don't want that person, right? That person would be horrible to work with. If that's what they're like in an interview when they're putting their best foot forward, I don't even want to know what they're like when they're under stress or when it's a bad day. Then you kind of think about culture fit. You know, people who are, you know, are always trying their best, but somehow they just always fall short. It's probably I'd say that I'd make this reference, but maybe not everybody on the call would get it. You know, I think about Gilligan. If everyone remembers Gilligan's Island, you know, Gilligan was this guy who was the first mate of the minnow in the show, and everybody liked him, and everybody wanted him to be, you know, wanted him as a friend. But the guy was a screw up. You know, the cast of the minnow were wrecked on a desert island, and they were trying to get off the island. And every time they came up with a plan, Gilligan came along and ruined it. You know, whether it was deliberate, didn't intend to ruin it, but just through his bungling of things, he screwed it up. So, you know, you'd say that maybe he's a great culture fit. People like him, but just not very productive. You know, we have a few of these folks. They tend not to stick around very long because we identify them as low performers, and we say, you know, you gotta pick up the pace. You've got to do better. So we try really hard not to have people in either of those two dimensions. What we really want are people who are high on both. And unfortunately, those are also the hardest people to find. We want people who are technically excellent, but also culturally excellent. One of the, oh, I have a spelling error. One of the things about my, the way I interview people, I always include a coding exercise. And that's a source of anxiety for people. People tend to not be very happy about there being a coding exercise. I've had folks refuse to do it. I've had people say that it's not a fair way to assess them. But in my coding exercise, a candidate is given a unit test and asked to implement code to make the test pass. The exercise always includes ambiguity, and there's a reason for that. I want to ask questions. I want to talk about the code. I want to talk about what you see in the problem. So tell me what you think is right here and what you think it merits more discussion. The approach I take is pair programming. I'm not there to grade the person. I'm not there to assess whether they've written perfect code or not. I'm just there to look at how they've, you know, I'm there to give ideas or for them to bounce ideas off of. So we're both able to type, and we talk about what would be a great approach. And I always tell people, version 1.0 of any piece of software you don't want. You always want 1.1 or 2.0 because 1.0 is always the bad one. It's always buggy. So this is 1.0. We're just trying to get it to MVP. We're trying to get it to work, and we'll come back and we'll solve it later. Nobody ever has 15 minutes to solve a real life problem. You always have a day or two. So this is just to get a scratch pad, you know, for me to understand whether or not you can write the code. I've had all kinds of interesting experiences where people have said, I have no idea what to do. And if that's a result of nerves, then usually I prompt the person and we move on. We solve the problem together. I've had people who claimed halfway through the exercise that their internet connection dropped. They weren't doing very well, so their internet connection failed, which means that they quit, basically. And that tells me a lot about what that person is like. Instead of saying, I don't know, or I can't do it, or I need help, they just bailed, you know, and that is usually a bad sign too. So on this slide, I know that text is really small, so you don't really have to try to look at it, but this is my scoring rubric for how I would assess somebody. So you notice I don't give people like a pass fail. I don't give them a letter grade. Instead, I measure them on lots of different dimensions. And I would say, did the requirements of the unit test, are the requirements satisfied? You know, the tests are passing. Is the code clean? Does it meet my standard for quality? Does the code include extensibility? Did they do the bare minimum, or have they left room for expansion? Have they thought about what might need to come next? How do they use their unit tests? Did they run it at the end to identify the bugs? Were they using the test to guide their development process? Did they even notice that did they even run the test at all? And then what was the interview style? Were they conversational? Was it, limited interaction? Did they treat me as a true peer? Because that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to simulate that work experience. And then finally, interview assistance. Did I do the exercise for them, or did they write the code? So then if we go back to this original scoring, I've had people who, once they see my coding exercise, they go, okay, hang on 1 second, I'm going to write the code. And they go heads down and they're completely silent and they type out the code and they say, okay, I'm done. Well, that's not really what I was looking for in the exercise. The point of the exercise is for me to assess whether or not somebody was a good fit. And that means having a conversation, having a thoughtful exercise where I talk about the problem and they talk about the problem. I give them the ideas, they give me some ideas, and we come up with some kind of mutually agreeable situation, mutual agreeable solution. So the interview process. The initial screening is usually 30 minutes of Q&A, then 30 minutes of a programming exercise. And maybe even that's maybe not quite true, because I always try to give people an opportunity to ask questions at the end. So we do 20, 25 minutes of Q&A, then 20, 25 minutes of programming. Once somebody passes the initial screening, we go to what I call the technical panel. So that's 1 hour with senior software engineers, an opportunity to discuss technology, the things they're doing. That's kind of the more traditional interview that you would normally relate to. A manager panel is usually 1 or more hiring managers. They're kind of looking for cultural fit. A project panel is like a project manager, scrum master, somebody who is assessing how they fit inside the organization, how they deliver value, if they understand, the overall software delivery process, things like that. We also have one additional round at Philips we call the bar raiser. And that's where an external manager meets with this person to assess what we call Philips behaviors. And the Philips behaviors are very corporate-y kind of sounding thing, like teaming up for success, putting customers first, focusing on quality. But ultimately what we're really looking for is assessing that fit into that 3x3 matrix. And it's helpful because some groups in Philips have a relatively immature hiring process. They don't hire a lot of people, so they're not great at identifying candidates. So that bar raiser is an external voice that says, I hire a lot of people, I meet a lot of people, and here's how I would measure this person against that. Now, the decision still rests with that group. They can say, hey, bar raiser, I don't care what you say, we want this person. Or they could say, hey, bar raiser, tell us whether we should hire this person, veto our opinion if you want. It's kind of up to that individual group to decide how they use the bar raiser. But the bar raiser is somebody who champions those Philips behaviors and can kind of assess somebody in terms of how do they fit in the organization? Is this the kind of person that they would want on their team? And then they can reflect on that. So I used about 20-ish minutes or so. So I'm going to stop for question and answers. I've got a couple more slides that I'll save for, I don't know, 5:20 or so. So maybe 25 minutes from now. I'll give you a little rundown on what Philips does in Pittsburgh, what sleep and respiratory care is all about. I'll mention some of the positions that we have available. Right before the call got started, I mentioned I can't resist the temptation to make a run at people because I'm a CMU alumni and you're all CMU students. And I'd say that we need CMU brains at Philips to help us solve some of the really complicated problems that we're dealing with. But I'm happy to talk about the interview process. I even have in the background, I got the coding, one of my sample coding exercises. So I would clue you in on types of questions I ask. It's not a question I'm currently using, so I've retired this question. So I promise you it would not be the question you would face if we were doing a programming exercise together, but it's indicative of the kind of questions that I ask. If there's anything you'd like to know about culture or about the interview process, about the tools, the technologies, typical engineer questions, typical manager questions, I'm happy to answer any of those.
So there's something in the chat, Eric.
Okay.
How should we prepare for a technical coding interview, especially in the last few weeks before the interview?
Yeah, that's a fair question. So I'm aware that Google and Facebook and some of those other companies will send you like a volume. They'll send you a book, like Cracking the Coding Interview and some of those other things. They ask really complicated problems, you know, that frankly is way beyond what I would expect someone to be able to do in an interview. Now, the interview process that we have, it's a little more simple. You know, I ask really basic questions that involve language syntax and you know, simple thought process to understand how you go from requirements to implementation. So I would say make sure you understand the basics of the language. You know what language you're going to be writing in. So I tell people in advance it's going to be Java. I also entertain Python if somebody is an expert in Python and they're just not comfortable with Java. But I'd say know your language, know basics of the language, that the general data structures, the way that the tests are written, and then just kind of make sure you've got the syntax down. Really not complicated stuff.
So I might add to that a question if I could. Some students use things like leak code, HackerRank to sort of practice the programming question. Is that something that you would find useful, or you would recommend as being helpful?
Yeah, I think practice is probably the key. I've had people say they use also a site called Code Fights, which I've never looked at before, but I guess it's sort of like competitive coding where there's some kind of problem that's defined and they want to see who can write the fastest running implementation that solves the problem, or do it in the least number of least lines of code, things like that. So I think any of those things that you can do to practice, those are all good ideas.
Great, thank you. And another question was, and this is probably more specific to Phillips, obviously you can answer for all companies, is the interview process all in one day, or is it over multiple days?
So that initial screening that people do with me occurs on one day, and then I would make a decision about whether or not they would advance to panel. So usually there's about a week lead time in between those two things. So somebody would be able to know in advance when those panels are going to occur. Now, the panels, you could probably do them in one day, but that would be a really long day. So I don't usually recommend that people try to do them all in one day. So I suggest that people spread them over 2 days, because it ends up being, if you try to do it in a day, you'd have to have an hour and then a gap and then an hour and a gap. And that would be a really exhausting work day. So, usually it's a 2-day process. And when we interviewed people in person, and we expected them to be on site, then of course we tried to put it into a single event. But now with virtual, doing so many Zoom interviews, there's just no reason to try to compress it all together.
Thanks. What are the differences of intern interviews versus full-time, if there is any, and do recruiters expect different aspects?
So I'd say intern interviews are actually really lightweight. So we currently have, this is part of my pitch, we currently have 8 open intern positions in the Pittsburgh area. We're hiring software developers for internships. The interview process there is only 30 minutes. So I meet with the person for 15 minutes. We talk about what they're currently studying, what they want to do in their internship. We write code for 15 minutes and a decision is made. So there's really not a lot of time between the meet and the decision. There's certainly not panels for internships. That's a very expensive process to pull those folks together. So we don't do that for interns. So for full time, that panel process is much more what we do. That senior interview, senior engineer interview, the manager, and then the product and the bar raiser. So that's really a full time position kind of interview process. Different aspects. Of course, we expect people who have graduated and have full-time work experience to be more skilled and have a different blend of skills and interests, and much more talk much more in depth about problems. So you know, I think there is definitely a higher bar if you're a full-time versus an intern or even a co-op position.
Right. Let's see if there's any other questions. I see a thing in the chat, but again, I a couple of questions as you were talking, Eric. So you had that you discussed when you evaluate candidates. There's both the technical and the technical and the soft skills, as it were. So if somebody, if someone just felt like, you know, I just couldn't make my code work. I just couldn't figure it out. Is that, it's probably an unfair question, but is that like, okay, you're probably not going to advance, or is it, yeah, your coding could have been a little better, but we like the other things about you?
Yeah, I've passed people into the panel interviews that didn't have functioning code. In fact, I've passed people that we really didn't write much code at all. And the reason is because if we had a really good conversation about software engineering or about writing tests, and we got really deep into the discussion about requirements, that's fine, you know, because that's a really important aspect too. We do sometimes ask people, if I don't get a great sense of their ability to write code, we do have what we call a Hacker Earth, and the Hacker Earth is a website. There's a programming exercise on there that we sometimes ask people to complete, and then they can write their code, and you know, in away from me staring at them, you know, because that also puts a lot of pressure on people. And I tell people I'm really great at typing, but if you try to make me type when anyone's watching, and with the number of people in here, if I tried to type, I don't think I would find the right key at all. I think I'd be able to hit the right letters, but I promise I'm really good at typing. So, you know, I try to cut people slack. I try to make sure that they are comfortable and that they are able to write code. And really the thought process is much more interesting to me than remembering the syntax of things. And that's why, you know, if somebody said to me, I feel like I write good code, but I didn't understand this problem and I really just struggled, that's okay. You know, let's talk about that. You know, if you're having a hard time getting started, let me write the first line of code. Let's see if that spurs some ideas. And if my line of code is terrible, tell me. Some people who have written excellent code, I kind of deliberately give them bad ideas just to kind of see if they'll take the bait. And sometimes they'll, you know, kind of go, oh, well, if you want to do it that way, then we can change all this stuff. And, you know, I kind of want to see if they'll push back and go, no, that's not a good idea because of, and then that's the discussion. Because that's also a real life thing too, where people give bad ideas, you know, not deliberately, but sometimes someone will say, you should do it this way. Well, you don't understand all the aspects of the problem, so maybe that's not the right answer.
This be related to what you just said, Eric, but someone mentioned in the chat they'd love to see the example coding exercise.
Okay.
Which, of course.
Sure. Like I said, I've retired this question. So this is my sample. So during a conversation, this is what I see. So I'll click this little button and I'll give them a URL. So I don't even know the URL myself until the interview has started. So this is a Java test, a unit test in JUnit, and usually I try to find weird, strange things, strange concepts that people have never heard of. So like this is a Dudani number, which frankly I don't think I've ever heard of outside of like this exercise. And what's funny is, you know, people will say things like, if I ask, have you ever heard of this concept? Someone say, yeah, I think I studied it in school. Like, no, you didn't. Okay, I went to college for 8 years, and this never came up once. Okay, so this is not something that is taught in school. It's just some weird quirk of mathematics. I don't know why it's useful, but somebody out there is running some EC2 instance looking for numbers that fit a pattern. They probably should be mining Bitcoin because it'd be way more profitable. But you know, there's some math person who's out there and they're interested in finding numbers that fit a particular pattern. So 512 is a Dudani number because if you take the individual digits, 5 and 1 and 2, and add them together and then raise them to the third power, you get 512. Weird quirk of mathematics, no clue why that's useful. but kind of cool, kind of interesting that you can get these like magic numbers. It makes me think of like Middle Ages alchemists, and they were looking for these special magic numbers, and they thought 27 was special because it was 3 to the 3rd power, stuff like that. So similarly, 513, or I don't know, maybe I changed my test. Maybe that should be 729 or whatever. Oh, 513 is not a Dudini number because 5 plus 1 plus 3 is 9. 9 raised to the 3rd power is 729. So that's not 513. We didn't get back to the original number. So I would tell the person who would, in this session, they'd be able to type the same way I could type. Let's figure out how we could implement an algorithm that would determine if the string supplied to us satisfies this expectation. So, people could start, we'd start brainstorming like, okay, well, what do we need to do first? Well, if we're going to do math here, this is a string. We can't do math on a string in Java. So what do we do? How do we get each number, each digit out of the number? Okay, so there might be a couple different ideas about that. We'll debate that. There might be some questions around, well, what if this string is not a number? Because what if somebody sends in something that we can't even interpret? How many of these Dudini numbers exist? Maybe 512 is the only one, in which case we just say, if it's 512, return true, else return false. That would be a really simple, straightforward thing. But the conversation is the important part. Let's talk about, what do you see in the problem? What ideas do you have? How many different ways could we build this? And then what do you think is the best one? And let's try to implement that in some kind of code. So this website, luckily, will let us click the run button. And once we have Java code, if we think it'll compile and we think it'll run, it'll execute the tests. And in this case, it fails because it says there's one test and there's 2 tests and 1 is failing. Hopefully we get to the point where we get 2 passing tests. But if we don't, that's not the end of the world. We can debate, what's wrong with it, or even if it's helpful. I've taken tests out. People said I don't have any idea what's wrong with it. But it just sort of helps me understand what their skills as a programmer would be. If somebody says, I have no idea what to do about this, or if they start typing some weird combination of languages, I've had people say, oh, this is easy. I'll just do input dot first plus input dot second plus input dot third. What is that exactly? That's not Java. That's not Java I've ever written. What are these methods? People try to bluff. If they really have no idea. Somebody writes this, I'm going to ask them, well, what's a first method? And maybe they're thinking that they're writing in some other language. But it gives me some idea. Do they know what they're talking about? Are they legitimate? And that's sort of what the exercise is all about.
Great, thank you. That was sounded very helpful. So another question in the chat, I don't know if you can see that, but these are great questions. We were asked a coding question that we know the solution to. Should we pretend, basically, so should we pretend that we don't know how to solve it right away, then solve it with brute force, go back and clean up the code and come up with this optimal solution? Or should we just do the one that's going to be a good solution first, but then they make it more difficult? They may add kind of things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think if you've seen the problem before, I think you want to be honest about that, because I think the whole point of the exercise is to have a open and honest conversation about what your skills and knowledge are. I think if I saw a problem that I absolutely knew the solution to, like if I knew what a Dudini number was and I knew how to solve it, I'd be like, well, I think I've seen this problem before, and here's what I think the solution should be. Now, maybe the interviewer is going to say, okay, cool, let's write that because I want to see how you implement it. If I'm trying to think of this one example where I had a programming exercise, and I don't want to give it away because I still occasionally use this, but I had a certain set of unit tests. And somebody who said, well, I would just import the Google Guava library that does this for me. Like, well, okay, I guess that's all right, but that's sort of not in the spirit of the exercise either. The point of the exercise is to explore some concept that hopefully you're not familiar with, understand and try to figure out what the requirements are, and then show the interviewer that you're able to navigate the uncertainty and identify the things that you don't know. I've had people ask me questions like, well, suppose somebody sends in a word, what should I do? And I would say, well, okay, that's a great question, because you can't do math on words, but we don't have any guidance from the unit test. We don't know. So if somebody sends in the word 5, that's not something we can do math on. So in your experience, what have you done in a similar way? Like what have you tried to, how have you tried to solve that problem? In the real world, we would present that question back to a product owner, and that, or a requirements person who would tell us what the customer is expecting. In the case where you have already seen the problem, you know what the perfect solution is. I think that deprives the interviewer, and really it deprives yourself of that experience, that shared discovery process of trying to figure out what you know and how you learn and how you solve a problem. So I would be honest about it and just say, you know what, I've seen this problem before. What should we do? I already know the answer, so I could code it up for you, but I already know what the optimum answer is.
So a related question, if you do get if one would get a problem that, yeah, this is tricky, it's going to take some time.
Yeah.
I know that there's a time constraint on my answer. Yeah. Is it a good strategy to, sort of alluding to what the question before, to solve it with brute force and just get it to run and then go back and optimize? Okay.
Oh yeah, I've absolutely done that. I've encouraged people, like, somebody said, well, it would be way easier to do this thing that's going to take a really long time. Okay, I appreciate your idea. Let's do the ugly solution and get as far as we can on that. And that's also why I don't hold people to this up or down grade. I don't necessarily say, well, you didn't get your code to compile, or you didn't get the test to pass, therefore you didn't pass my coding exercise. It's not like that at all. You had ideas. In fact, you had 2 ideas. You had a brute force and you had a more elegant solution. Now, nobody is ever given 15 minutes to solve a real world problem. Well, nobody at Philips anyway. There might be people in, other places, who have to solve really complicated problems on the spur of the moment. But we would always have time to think about what the right solution is and to build that better answer. Maybe we have to do the brute force to get it out the door, and then we can come back to version 2.0 and make it better. But I think that's a really great point of conversation. If you can say, I see 2 answers here. I can think of 2 different ways to do this. Let's talk about those. Let's explore those, and then if we have time, we'll do one or the other.
So it sounds like the keys you've been talking about pretty much throughout the session was, these themes came out for me anyway, it's a collaborative kind of effort. It's also being honest. If you don't know something, you own up to you don't know it, and also just making sure that you're thinking out loud, that you're not just sitting there typing code and the person has no idea what you're doing.
Yeah. So and that goes back to my matrix, right? The what and the how. So we want people who are able to write code. We don't want people who pound out perfect code and never talk to anybody. One of the great challenges, one of the reasons that the great resignation, or the great transition, or whatever we're calling it now, of people leaving their jobs, it's been really painful for Philips, because we had a lot of knowledge silos where people were experts in one thing, and that was the area they worked in, and there were only a couple of people who really knew that. And then when those people leave, that creates a void, and that's really problematic. And that's really problematic for a lot of organizations. People who are communicative and expressive and like to share their ideas, that reduces the pain to the organization. Because if I'm sharing my ideas with you and I'm talking with you on a regular basis about the things I'm doing and the way I'm solving problems, well, that automatically creates an audit trail, and that automatically creates some knowledge sharing that creates, organizational knowledge and organizational inertia that makes it harder to erode the knowledge base of the company. So, those are the kind of people we want. We want the people who can write great code, but also share that knowledge and want to be able to talk to other people about it and say, look at this great thing I built, because that's where we're successful. That's going to make us a more successful company.
Great. Other questions? Okay, I'll be selfish. Get another question in. Well, I have a chance to talk to a recruiter. So I get students who the dilemma for them is, I want to be ready for a technical interview, and I want to practice. I want to, breaking the code. I'm going to read that. They want to just practice and practice. So they're as prepared as they can be. But the problem is, if you wait too long, then by the time you apply to, say, your dream company, it's, we've already filled our slots. We're done. So is the question, do I just jump in and be as prepared as reasonably well, but not gonna, I'm still going to feel like I have butterflies, and I'm not sure about everything, or is it better to be, I'm going to make sure that I'm going to just knock this out of the park and take the risk that the opportunity won't be there.
Yeah, I think interviewing is a skill, and one of the reasons that we do technical screenings like the ones that I do is because there are people who are professional interviewers. They're really good at answering questions. They're really good at bluffing those talent acquisition folks. So when you put code in front of them, sometimes they can't do it because they're just basically salesmen. They sell themselves on their resume. So I think the way that you get good at interviews is you do them. You practice mock interviews. You get your friend or your instructor or someone from career services to walk through your resume. You practice your elevator pitch. You know the kinds of things you're going to talk about. You have a cheat sheet of your 3 biggest accomplishments. And one of the dirty secrets of interviewing and really public speaking in general, or answering Q&A, is if you know the talking points that you like to hit, you can change almost any question into the answer that you want to give. So there was a panel where Bill Gates and some other really big technology executives were talking, and politicians do this all the time too. Tell me about, what do you think about gun control in America? Well, I'm glad you asked that question. If you look back at my record, you'll see that 1, 2, 3, and 4. The answer might not perfectly dovetail with the question that was asked, but you hit the points you wanted to sell on. So practice those questions, practice those points, plan for the things that you want to say, and try to answer the questions that are given to you, but direct them in a way that is the most advantageous to you. I would say that the way you get good at programming is you do it a lot, and nobody's born knowing how to do it. So interviewing is kind of the same way. Nobody's born being great at it. You just have to try it.
Great, thank you. A little bit of time here, so a few quick questions. So somebody was saying if how to prepare for coding interviews, if you're looking for like machine learning, data science kind of positions, mostly this person does mathematical coding and not necessarily conventional software problems. So how would they pivot or get ready for that kind of interview?
Yeah, that's a question I'm not sure I can answer. I'm going to be honest. I don't know how to answer that question, because I can speak about the kind of interviews that I give, and I don't know that I would know what a machine learning problem would even look like. So if I took that interview, I'd probably fail, because I wouldn't be able to answer the question. So I mean, I think if you were to simply go to Google and type in, machine learning programming exercises or machine learning programming questions, there's probably going to be a bank of things out there. There's websites that professional certification exams, other things. Those are going to be kind of typical of the questions that you're going to get in a technical screening. So be prepared for those sorts of questions, I would think.
Great, thank you. And a great example of, I'm not sure, I don't know, accurate
Yeah,
prediction.
I don't know. I can
Right.
speak about my process, and I can speak about the kinds of interviews that that I would like to see. If I've done some machine learning or some some stuff in Python where it was finding regression algorithms that most accurately predicted the flow through. So it may be that by importing those things, maybe you have a data set and some of you want to say, how would you implement some kind of machine learning algorithm that would most accurately predict the expression that would do this, and they would ask you to show how you'd build that or talk about it or talk about the gotchas in some kind of data model. I can imagine those kinds of questions, but I'm really not sure.
Great, that's great advice. So a couple final questions here. So I want to know, as a recruiter, are there different qualities, focus, or changes or points of focus that you look for in the initial interview versus second stage versus maybe the final? And they're referring, I think, to behavior-based interviews, not technical.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I would expect people to be the same person they are, honestly. So, if I meet somebody and I say, this person is great, and then the panel meets them and they say, this person is terrible. Usually we have to come back together and say, well, what was different? What changed? Did we catch somebody on a bad day? And likewise, I've interviewed a candidate before, and then I said, no, this person is not a fit. And then somehow they ended up interviewing a different group. And usually talent acquisition has notes, and they'll say, well, Eric previously interviewed this person. And I'll talk about my experience, and I'll say, how did you interview this person? And often other groups who don't do like programming exercises, for example, will say, well, that person seemed great. They knew all of the buzzwords of programming languages. They said this, that. Yeah, but let me pull up the interview that we did together 3 months ago on codeinterview.io that makes a movie out of it at the end. So, I can show you exactly what keystrokes they hit. They had no idea how to solve this problem. So, I'm going to say that they sold you on themselves. They were their professional interviewers. But I hope that people are honest about who they are and in terms of their skills and their abilities and even their limitations. Because ultimately that's going to make you happy in your career. If you present yourself as somebody who you're not, eventually that's not going to work out very well. The real you is going to be displayed. You got to remember that interviewing is a two-way process. You can sort of think of it as you're presenting yourself to this job, but the job is presenting itself to you. If you're not comfortable working 80 hours a week and this job says a lot of overtime, let's be honest, maybe that's not the right position for you. If this job is a lot of sales or a lot of in-person meetings and you're more of a math person and you'd rather write the code and you don't want to do those in-person things, be honest. That's probably not the right position for you. So I think we account for growth, but we also ask people, know yourself and know what you're good at, know what makes you happy. Philips is a healthcare company. Part of healthcare involves mental health, and that means doing the position and doing the job that you like to do.
Great, thank you. This is a great question. Somebody wants to know, what's the best end of interview questions about the company you ever ask?
So, best end of interview question.
About
I'll tell you, I hate the question of, did I do well? Did I pass? Did I get the job? I say never ask that question, because I can't stand that. And here's an example of when you don't want to answer the question, you change the answer to answer the question answer a different question. So I always then fall back to, well, we measure people on multiple dimensions, on cultural fit and technical fit, and then I explain the two dimensions. So I never tell somebody, yes, you did awesome, or no, you did terribly. So there's no point asking the question because I'm not going to tell you. I think the best questions are almost always, describe what you're doing at Philips. Describe why I should consider this position. Describe why working at Philips is different or special or exceptional, because that indicates a true interest in the position, and also you want to know whether you're going to fit into the organization. So anything you can ask about the job itself is usually a very good question to ask. I don't know what the best one. I mean, like I said, the worst ones are easy to think of, but the best ones are usually a little harder to come up with.
Yeah. So final question here, we're running out of time. Someone wants to know, is Java the main language used at Phillips for software development? They said you had mentioned that you might accept interviewees using Python.
Sure.
So is there other positions that use other languages?
Yeah, so in the interview process, I'm willing to say Java and Python because to me, software development is kind of a thought process. The physical words that you type are not as important as the thought process to come up with how to solve a problem. So we use Java. So I try to encourage people to do Java. We have some Python development. In particular, we use Python for scripting languages in kind of like the DevOps positions. But to me, if you're an expert in Python and you have never seen Java before in your life, you probably still have a lot of understanding of concepts of clean code, of quality, of testing, validating things. You understand the idea of decomposition. You probably understand polymorphism, inheritance. You can understand how to stand up a service. You probably know about REST standard. You probably know about SOAP. So all of those things are relevant, and all of those things kind of indicate that you could do the job. You just don't happen to know if it's dot size or dot length, or is it system.out.print or system.out.println. You don't remember the syntax. None of that matters. The thought process of being a good software developer is more important to me, and that's why I'm sort of indifferent between people doing specific languages. I encourage those two because those are the two that I know the best personally. If somebody wrote Ruby, I'd just be like, I don't know, is this good code? I'm not really sure myself. So
well, on that note, I think we'll have to conclude. Eric,
okay.
Thank you so much. This was extremely informative for the group.